Ralph Simon of Zomba Music, you may recall, was our bearded, friendly South African music publisher. Once, while temporarily bereft of a home, I was sleeping on a mattress in a vacant room in his Battery Studios. Ralph leapt into action as he apprehended what he assumed was a burglar. "Aha! Got you!" he yelled as he burst into the room. "Hello, Ralph," I replied. "Who is he?" my girlfriend asked, rather more pointedly, and covering up various regions that I wasn't already covering up. Ralph thought this all very rock and roll and took to calling me Mr. Libido in polite conversation, which could sound quite creepy coming from a middle-aged lawyer with an Afrikaans twang to his voice. Ralph was also a sort of savant when it came to music as well. After the success of Run to the Hills, he took me to one side and said, "You know, what you have is that high-pitched octave that makes the Americans go raving mad." "Really?" I replied. "Yes, absolutely. You know, Mutt Lange has the same thing." Well, equipped with this insight, I muddled through for the next few years until Ralph popped into the management office one day, and this time I had my clothes on. "How would you like to do a soundtrack to a movie?" he said. Well, having just come off Seventh Son, I was completely in the space to do a movie soundtrack. Except it wasn't actually a soundtrack to a movie at all. It was one song for a Nightmare on Elm Street number 5, I believe, in the franchise. There's only a small budget. Well, how much is small? I inquired. Small was big enough. I phoned Yannick. "You can't sell your gear. You've got to do a track with me, and if you still want to sell it, I'll buy it off you, and you can use it when you want." I'd never seen a Freddy Krueger film, so I asked someone in the pub, "A Nightmare on Elm Street, what's that all about?" "Oh, well, teenage girls go to sleep and then get slashed by this scary old dude, but he only gets them in their sleep." Ah, a love story then. The track was wanted almost instantly, so I had to come up with a tune pretty quick. If in doubt, borrow a guitar and play the first thing that sounds good. I have a totally untested theory that every guitar has a tune in it, and this particular one turned up Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. It was only the chorus, and the rest of the song was a sort of AC/DC Bon Scott-style pastiche with a tongue-in-cheek section of mad monks chanting over tolling bells. We cranked out the song in Battery Studios in a couple of days. We laughed, giggled, and drank beer to celebrate, and in general had a relaxed time making music, away from the more intense atmosphere that pervaded the Maiden camp. The track was too late for the movie, but not too late for CBS Records, who heard it and did backflips. They wanted to give me a solo deal. Ralph phoned me up. "Is there any more material like that?" "Oh, yeah, loads," I lied. 2 weeks later, I was telling the truth. Yannick's house in Hounslow was right under the flight path of Heathrow Airport. Not just a bit under, but I mean the wheels were almost putting a dent in his roof as they screamed overhead. It meant the next-door neighbours didn't complain about the odd scream emanating from his lounge windows as we wrote the album. We had to crack on, so I just made a list of staple rock songs. We already had a sort of AC/DC one. We needed a ballad, an anthemic one, a sort of Rolling Stones groove one, a boogie-type thing, maybe a cover as well. Luckily, I'd recently done a charity show for the Prince's Trust at Wembley. I was given the Bowie song All the Young Dudes to perform, which of course was a seminal track for Mott the Hoople. I was more surprised than anyone that it seemed a natural fit for my voice, although, to be fair, I don't think we improved on the original. Then, while having a beer one night, I went for a piss, and there on the wall were the Proustian lines. "No muff too tough, we dive at 5. Couple more beers, and some further stupidity about the legendary children's TV show, Captain Pugwash, and Dive, Dive, Dive was born, or rather, submerged. At least I had a 4-foot submarine to feature in the video. The Single Tattooed Millionaire was written unexpectedly after talking about Graham Bonnet, the one-time singer in Rainbow, with an extraordinary high and raspy voice. And then Yannick played what is, for me, the best song on the album, and also the name of the first chapter in this book. The TV was on in the background, sound turned down, and Jan played the opening chords to what became Born in '58. I asked what it was. "Oh, something I had kicking around." The instrumental portion was virtually complete. I just added the vocal over the top of it. EMI Records had given each of us in Maiden a one-off option to make a solo album. Well, now was the time to exercise that option. Who should show up to make the video for Tattooed Millionaire but Storm Thorgerson of Hypnosis and Pink Floyd fame? Storm came via a contact of a new manager at Sanctuary, Maiden's management company. Not quite a yellow submarine, but rather a subterranean submarine, upping its periscope into the lurid lifestyles of the rich and infamous was the basic premise of the video. I was very enamoured of the submarine control room and wanted to install it in my attic, complete with periscope, but the men in white coats explained that it all belonged to a prop house. Such a disappointment. I watched Storm direct, and the cheeky thought occurred to me that he was having far too much fun making all these videos. "You're just making it up, aren't you?" I whispered to him one day. "Don't let on, dear boy," he whispered back to me. Chapter 28. Fault Lines. America turned the page and I re-entered Iron Maiden world, having unwittingly written what would turn out to be our only #1 single. The reason Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter isn't on Tattooed Millionaire is because it was requisitioned by Steve for the new album, No Prayer for the Dying. Of course, it had to be re-recorded. The idea was mooted that we should somehow go back to our roots. We would record everything at Steve's house and use the Rolling Stones mobile studio, which all sounded rather grand. There's a line in Smoke on the Water that immortalised the ancient ruin that pulled up outside Steve's Grade 2 listed manor house. Honestly, I think we had all fallen under the spell of papal infallibility. Why is the Pope always right? Well, because he is the Pope and can never be wrong. Well, what if he actually is wrong? This is simply a difference of opinion, and the only opinion that matters is, of course, the Pope's. Bands, business leaders, popes, and entire countries fall victim to their own circular beliefs. Indeed, they become the ultimate victims of their own success, desperate to avoid uncertainty and surrounded by people who always agree. They cross the line from artistic integrity to artistic stagnation. Maiden had a double problem, in that it was becoming harder to break out of a core audience without radically changing the sound of the band. The latter was simply not an option. The sound of the band was its identity, unlike other bands who flipped and flopped according to fashion. Maiden's success was based on reinventing the wheel that drove the heavy metal bus. Its dilemma was how to reinvent the wheel with every new album and tour. Maiden had gone way beyond the third album watershed moment. The big question was, how would the band sustain its trajectory into being legends and not start a slow parabola into the dustbin of history? Our problem, in my opinion, was that no one was acknowledging that big question. Things were, quite frankly, too good to be true. For the second time in my Iron Maiden career, a major schism occurred. Adrian Smith quit. Nobody saw it coming, and I don't believe Adrian did either, in the same way that no one intentionally steps into quicksand or plays hopscotch in a minefield. A Roman soldier was famously supposed to fall on his sword to avoid dishonour, but I'm not sure Adrian knew there was a sword lying in wait as he voiced his concerns about the upcoming album one fateful afternoon. He clearly wasn't happy with the current state of affairs, but I don't believe he wanted out. He just wanted to make it better. Conversation turned into accusation, and, in the end, it was our own hubris, fueled by our seemingly untouchable success, that sealed his fate. He was not fired. He simply walked into a lift shaft where there was no lift. Management, of course, took care of the press fallout in what was quite a surprising story. Maiden's management have always been fanatically devoted to the band at all costs, which is exactly what is required most of the time. Few bands in history have had such a dedicated manager as Rod Smallwood. I once had to give him an award as Manager of the Year at an awards dinner. It was all supposed to be a secret, and it was difficult enough just to get him to turn up. The room was full of his peers, plus the great and the good, the bad and the ugly from the music industry. "I fucking hate these things," he grumbled. "Anyway, what the fuck are you doing here?" I scribbled on a pad under my jacket, notes for my speech. "What are you fucking writing?" "I bloody hate this." At which point, an eager American music executive flashed his Instabright $1,000 perfect bite at Rod and said, "Mr. Smallwood, it's an honour. I've always been an admirer of your work." Any minute now, the business card would come out. "You think I'm in the music business, don't you?" Rod said. "Why, yes, I'm not in the music business. I'm in the Iron fucking Maiden business." With that retort, the young lion retreated, having been well and truly biffed by the old contender from Huddersfield. The secret of his success was that he was focused entirely on the band, not on the well-being of any other creature on earth save family. His success in guiding our career was enabled by his partner and our lifelong business manager, Andy Taylor. With a first-class degree from Cambridge, where he and Rod met in 1969, Andy's navigated and negotiated Maiden's financial survival and has permitted us the creative freedom to play music without looking over our shoulder. But neither Rod nor Andy have ever had any significant input into our musical endeavours. Indeed, there has for many years been a total exclusion zone in the recording studio, banning managers, agents, lawyers and record companies from chucking their opinions about. Most of the time, I think this is a good thing. Sometimes, though, everyone needs a little guidance. Unless, of course, you are the Pope. Because then you can always ask God, and he's never wrong. Right? Rod must have had divine guidance, as Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter was #1 in the UK after Christmas, much to the chagrin of the BBC and self-styled pop music gurus. As a service to the nation, it knocked the ubiquitous Sir Cliff Richard from the hallowed top slot and propelled us out of the Christmas break with a grin on our faces. We actually ended up at #1 for 2 weeks and, due to a bizarre legal requirement, the BBC were obliged to play short extracts of the song through gritted teeth. It's a shame they weren't paying more attention to Jimmy Savile instead of writhing on the hook of a tongue-in-cheek horror movie soundtrack. Adrian's surprise departure left some exit wounds, and these could not simply be stitched up by clever PR and careful manipulation of the UK chart system. An essential piece of the Iron Maiden jigsaw was now missing, and the new piece, in the guise of Yannick Gers, didn't match the space. There's no reason why Yannick should have sounded like a copy of Adrian at all. His style was clearly different, but we were bereft of the melodic duelling with Dave Murray's more florid style. Dave tended to fuse torrents of notes cascading over the solo sections, whereas Adrian always felt as if his solos were on the edge of a precipice, real cliffhangers, so you hung on every note. Jan's guitar style and sound were more spiky and less processed, but I hoped that his arrival would see a bit more of the Yannick that played on Tattooed Millionaire start to rub off on the Iron Maiden sound. Caught up in the enthusiasm of a first album, it was too much to expect of him. But our next album, Fear of the Dark, was an opportunity to move things on in a world that was changing fast. The Aleister Crowley movie was gaining some traction at last. The catalyst was a song I'd written called Man of Sorrows. The beastly script that eventually became Chemical Wedding was based on a reworking of Somerset Maugham's novel The Magician. Maugham had met Crowley, loathed him on sight, and created the character of Oliver Haddo, the evil sorcerer trying to create the homunculus, or moonchild, in his lair in Scotland. Crowley himself wrote a similar novel, actually called Moonchild, but with far less of the hammer horror plot of Maugham's. Maiden's lyrics are littered with references to Crowley, from Revelations to Moonchild and Powerslave. Julian Doyle and I had frequent script meetings. One rewrite was done by Jimmy Sangster, who wrote many of the original Hammer movies. I actually liked it. Julian thought it was horrible and too traditional. We ploughed on, staying in the period up till 1947, when Crowley died of a heart attack. He was taking enough heroin every day to kill a dozen normal mortals at the time. I'd written a rather dramatic first 5 minutes that took place at the top of K2, where Crowley led an ill-fated expedition. He was a world-class climber, despite his asthma and drug addiction. That scene, plus the demo track Man of Sorrows, saw the film being optioned by Velvel, Walter Yetnikov's fledgling production company. Walter had been executive producer of Ruthless People and now had an appetite for the movies, after CBS Records had been sold to Sony Music for rather more than it was worth. Walter had 3 movies he planned to make, and mine was one of them. Money actually changed hands, and I flew out to LA to discuss the script. They were paying the bills, so I had no objection to a script doctor coming on board to move things along. In fact, I was interested to see the process, because, as far as screenplay writing was concerned, I was making it up as I went along, except for guidance from a few self-help DIY manuals. Julian was dismissive of structure in a traditional sense. I wasn't so sure, and anyway, this was all a bit of an adventure. For the next 2 years, the script shuttled across the Atlantic, and I awaited the results of the doctor's surgery. It seemed to take an awfully long time. In contrast, the latest Iron Maiden album took no time at all. The rehearsal space in the barn now had a second-hand studio installed in the cramped confines of its roof. I thought the project laudable, but flawed in its execution. The vocals were done, and I got on with winning fencing competitions and writing scripts. I was also busy coming up with a 3rd book in the Lord Iffy series, tentatively taking our odd bod Laird back to his school days. Looming large was the option to record a follow-up to Tattooed Millionaire. Yannick was totally absorbed in Maiden by now, and there were various suggestions as to who should be my writing partners. I realised that I didn't know any musicians anymore. In fact, I didn't know much about anything outside of Iron Maiden, so complete had the submergence been for the last 10 years. Chapter 29. Wingnut. On holiday in Florida, I picked up the phone and dialed. Trial flight lessons, $35. Microsoft Flight Simulator wasn't nearly real enough. 17th of July, 1992, is the first entry in a battered brown logbook that records 1 takeoff and 1 landing at Kissimmee Airfield in Florida. It might just as well have described the journey that Paul undertook to Damascus. My conversion took place in a Cessna 152 and was caused by half the velocity of the air over the wing squared multiplied by the coefficient of lift of the airfoil involved. Thus enlightened, my weight was borne heavenwards, or my mass, if you are a Catholic, and, freed of life's drag by the whirling air screw boring its way through the air, I thrust my way onwards and upwards. In short, I could fly. I'm not a numbers person. I prefer to use words or pictures. Most pilots are probably the other way round, but numbers or words, the emotional response to a first flight I found overwhelming, life-changing, and fascinating. The Cessna 152 is a tiny 2-seat high-wing aircraft which on the ground appears flimsy in the extreme. Yet here I was, at 1,500 feet above the Florida landscape, with the sunset just beginning and the rolling Everglades and lakes crisscrossed by roads and waterways. It was a meeting of all worlds, poetic, mechanical, logical, daring, experimental, creative, internal and external. In one moment I realised that this confection of aluminium and rivets was keeping me alive. Moreover, in the air, I was an interloper and had to respect the ways of the wind, the temperature, the density of the medium in which I hung, suspended only by a difference in pressure, which, although real, might just as well have been an act of faith. Yet still the conundrum deepened. Where would I go? How would I navigate? How could I predict what failures might occur, and when? From the outside view to the internal turning over of eternal what-if questions, the business of flying was unknowable. If you flew every day for the rest of your life, you would never be able to say, I've seen it all, know it all, and have done it all. I took one long panoramic stare from wingtip to wingtip, and all of these thoughts boiled instantly in my very core. And then my reverie was suddenly shattered. My instructor was quite a serious type, and I think he spotted someone who was about to take flying equally seriously. "Now, Mr. Dickinson, how do you feel about landing it?" he said. I'm sure that most of the landing was him, but no matter. I was eager to hurl myself off the precipice. I was supposedly on holiday in Disney World, but in fact, I went flying every single day for the next week. By day 5, I had 5.5 hours in my little logbook and 22 landings. It said I'd taken off, climbed, descended, practiced stalls, made steep turns at 45 degrees, flown very slowly, and simulated engine failures. My instructor asked me how much longer I was going to be in Florida. I said I had to go back to England and start a tour. "Oh, that's a shame," he said. "If you'd got yourself a medical, I'd have soloed you in a couple of days." I bet you say that to all the boys, I thought. But somewhere, deep down, I was kicking myself that I hadn't joined the Air Cadets. The fear of the dark tour took over, and the next chance I got to fly was in California, in the midst of the tour. Santa Monica Airport, a delightful gem and a haven of aviation joy and esprit de corps, was nestled in the lee of the Santa Monica Mountains, just behind Venice Beach. Little did I realise that this airport would begin a new chapter in my life and that I would return to it for years to come. Justice Aviation, owned by Joe Justice, was the biggest independent flying school and plane rental business on the field. I just turned up and asked to go flying. My instructor was a physics graduate who had also graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and his dad was a colonel in the US Air Force. I had long brown hair and wore shorts and goofy T-shirts. He was, I thought, very laid back for such a straight-laced background, so I made a mental bookmark. To borrow a phrase from Arnie in The Terminator, "I'll be back." After the USA, we finally made it, all too briefly, to New Zealand. By now, thoroughly bitten by the flying bug, I sought out Ardmore Airport and went in search of more knowledge. "Can I do a spin?" I inquired. "No, mate, I can't let you do a spin, but I can do one, and you can tell me what you think." The nose of the plane went up, the engine note back to idle, one wing dropped so the earth was to my left, and my backside was going the opposite direction. All at once, the left window view said sky, earth, and the view through the front window said earth upside down, earth getting much bigger, earth, and suddenly, abruptly, the rotation stopped, the wings levelled, and the engine note resumed its normal busy grumble. I sat in silence. I was still in silence when I got back to the briefing hut. What was going on here? "I've never had a blackboard lesson so far," I said. Teach me something." What I got was straight out of RAF Central Flying School. Beautifully explained graphs of lift, drag, and how it related to airspeed and angle of attack, and after an hour of that, we went through the spin, how it happened, and what happened. Back in England, I went to Elstree Aerodrome and took one more lesson in my unstructured try before you buy, learn to fly course. Unlike California and New Zealand, England was green and misty, and aircraft seemed to crawl around in the weeds, forbidden to fly any higher than telegraph poles, lest they should collide with stray airliners. Visual navigation in England was more like orienteering than navigating. My flight simulator on my heavyweight laptop used radio navigation instruments, and these were all fitted to the Grumman AA5 that I was learning on. I noticed the instructor had a map, stopwatch, and chinograph pencil and ruler. "Why don't we take a bearing off a radio beacon?" I asked. "Good God, you're not allowed to do that! It's not in the syllabus! Stopwatch, paper and pencil, old chap!" Note to self, must brush up on mental arithmetic. My next appointment was back in Santa Monica in November 1992. I had a couple of months in the studio to produce what would end up being Balls to Picasso, my second solo album, and I decided that I would be in possession of a pilot's license by the end of it. I got rather more than I bargained for in both departments. Most people were under the impression that Tattooed Millionaire had been a serious attempt at a solo record, when in fact it was just a bit of fun, well executed, and with a lot of record company enthusiasm behind it. The next record, for me, had to be something much more serious. And what I didn't want was a same old rehash of 70s hard rock. Bands like Soundgarden and Faith No More actually sounded innovative, whereas the traditional metal world often looked like transsexuals in need of a shave. Maiden had always stood apart from any defining tribe, even though we were endorsed by quite a few. My problem was to establish where I belonged in modern rock music, if indeed I belonged in it at all. I had been steered in the direction of working with a traditional metal band called Skin. This was in the erroneous belief that I wanted to make a sequel to Tattooed Millionaire in the same vein. I wasn't happy with the result. As I scratched my head in bemusement at my lack of creative spark, the thought occurred to me that perhaps my time was done. Maybe Maiden was as far as I got in this life. I could take solace in the advice the cannibal who doesn't want to eat his neighbour was given by his hungry friend. Oh, stop moaning, shut up and eat the chips. At the end of the Fear of the Dark tour, I'd been on the bus back to Narita Airport in Tokyo. We were going home, and it was another self-satisfied success. I tried to raise my concerns about the sound and production of our albums, about the assumption of perfection and the lack of honest criticism within the band. Everyone looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, or maybe we were on the slow trajectory to a luxurious creative extinction. Los Angeles would be the origin of my new future. My tapes from the recording sessions with Skin had been sent off to Keith Olsen, a producer of some repute, with the aim of salvaging, reworking, remodelling, and generally reconstructing the album. Keith had his own studio in LA and had reworked David Coverdale's records, turning them into American radio monster hits. The problem was that I preferred David Coverdale produced by Martin Birch. The radio success equalled soulless perfection in my eyes. Nevertheless, I turned up in LA, started to navigate my way round the 10 to the 405 to the 5 and the endless numerical cat's cradle that comprises the freeway system, and arrived on the doorstep of Goodnight LA Studios. Keith listened to my set of tapes and rough mixers. "I'm interested because you can actually sing," he declared. "You really have a voice." Damned by such faint praise, I suggested we scrap all of it and start again. I wasn't in the mood for half measures. I was also paying for it myself. I wanted a dark and emotionally jagged record, in line with my thoughts at the time. One of the albums I referenced was Peter Gabriel's third album, which I regarded and still do as a masterpiece. Keith imported session keyboard players to work with me, plus different drummers, guitarists, and backing singers. It was fascinating, but artistically barren. The level of technical expertise in all of them was astonishing, but they were smooth and effortless. Life is not like that, and nor did I want my own music to be like that. The icebreaker in all of this was Keith's engineer, the rather colourful character that was Shea Baby. He was an ex-US Marine who'd done his time in Vietnam and now did his time in the recording studio. As I reworked and waded through musical treacle, trying to find my way through the Grimpen mire to a Sherlock Holmes moment of revelation, Shea provided me with the compass. "Come and see my buddy's tribe of gypsies," he suggested, so I did. In another revelatory moment, I had my faith in music rekindled by this astonishing combo. The main writer and lead guitarist, Roy Z, had been a crack addict and was essentially saved by music from a life of gang violence. The conga player was already an ex-gang member and had done time in jail. The bass player, Eddie, was so cool that even the gangs in the barrios gave him respect and agreed a truce around his house. Eddie was a rock. The whole Latino scene in LA was unknown and a mystery to a rich Anglo kid, but my saving grace was that they were all rabid Iron Maiden fans. If they'd been a man of war, I think they would have sunk half the Royal Navy. They were so good. There was love and power and passion and soul and no money, no managers, no politics. Watching their gig was both inspiring and depressing because they deserved so much more than half the bands out there. I went round to Shea's house and met Roy Z, one-on-one, plus a guitar or two. He was embarrassed to ask if we could write together, assuming that the almighty Bruce Dickinson wouldn't be interested. I was equally convinced that Roy didn't need an old crock like me making suggestions when it was manifestly clear that his band was sensational. By mid-afternoon, we had each other bouncing off the walls. By early evening, we needed small buckets of beer to calm us down. All it took was Roy playing one guitar riff, which turned out to be the opening to a track called Laughing in the Hiding Bush. I thought you might be able to do something with this, was how the process started. Back in Goodnight LA Studios, I was halfway through the second incarnation of my solo effort, and I realised that the previous day's efforts with Roy Z had made it obsolete overnight. I was going to have to start again. To scrap one album is understandable. To scrap two is careless. To scrap three is just creative payback for 10 years of making music in the same silo. I was renting a small house in Brentwood, just up the road from where the O.J. Simpson murder occurred. A heaving mass of sinful carnality, it certainly was not, at least not on the streets after dark. Indoors, perhaps, was another matter. LA is a very early town. Maybe the movies and the 5 a.m. makeup starts have rubbed off on the rest of the population, or maybe these stupidly early joggers are just prescription drug addicts living in plain sight. But in any case, after getting back from the studio in the evening, bed was really the only option. I was on track to deliver my now third attempt at the album, which I was determined to finish in the UK, with Shay Baby in charge of production and using elements of what I had already recorded in Goodnight LA. Crucially, I would bring over Roy and the Tribe of Gypsies to West London and finish my new recordings at the Powerhouse Studios in Stamford Brook. I was also on track to get my pilot's licence before the end of February. Pilot's licences come in all shapes and sizes, and the USA issues its own, which are recognised by but are not the same as those of European authorities and in particular the British. I was using the US syllabus, and the licence would be an original issuance of a US licence. I went on to garner various other US licences up to commercial pilot and flight instructor for single and multi-engined aircraft. I stopped short of bothering with the airline transport pilot licence because by that time I had a British airline pilot's licence and was rather busy with a multitude of other activities. Right now in California, I was after the most humble of US licences, a single-engined land plane, as opposed to seaplane, licence, which would allow me to fly around day or night, as long as I stayed nowhere near a cloud and avoided other aircraft, objects and people by use of the Mark I human eyeball, 2 of which are fitted to this human unit and fully serviceable. I equipped myself with maps, or charts, as my instructor insisted I call them, and a circular computational slide rule from the Second World War, plus pencils, plexiglass rulers calibrated in nautical miles, and a protractor to measure angles. Ever the master of pragmatism, the US conveniently published all the questions on their database for the written examinations. Ever the model of free enterprise, books were available with the answers to all 1,000 or so questions, along with worked examples of weights and balances, navigational, technical, aerodynamic and regulatory problems. I imagined people with brains the size of planetariums who didn't go out very much constructing these books, which now, of course, are all available on the internet as interactive instruction programs. I spent early evenings and sometimes late evenings with my head down, bashing through the syllabus and practice paper after practice paper. The pass mark in the exam was 80%, and it was conducted by computer, which created a bespoke test for each individual. The inconvenient truth was that it was possible to cram for the test and scrape a pass. It wasn't my intention, but it was nevertheless a possibility. My straight-laced but laid-back instructor started to quiz me as we progressed through our flying to simulate the test. The winter weather in Los Angeles can be surprisingly unhelpful. Coastal fog, 3-day deluges, and mountain wind effects can all conspire to scupper the most determined schedule. If it rained, I did ground school. If it was foggy, I must admit to a fascination since childhood. What daydreams and apparitions could it contain? I would eat breakfast at the Spitfire Grill by the side of the runway and watch the rolling tumbleweed of sea mist curl around the control tower as the airport sat in eerie silence. It was then that ghosts appeared. The ghost of the Douglas Aircraft Company that built the DC-3 right here in Santa Monica. The airfield was originally known as Clover Field, and aviation started there in 1923. Just offshore lay Catalina Island, with its airport perched atop the fog when it rolled in. Over the mountains to the north was the Mojave Desert, scene of the right stuff and still home to mysterious spooks of its own, including US Air Force Base Plant 42 at Palmdale Airport with Lockheed Martin and the infamous Skunk Works. I loved the desert. When I obtained my license, I would often hire a plane and fly out to near Joshua Tree or Apple Valley. If it was early enough in the morning, the silence after cutting the engine was deafening. My breathing was the loudest sound. The effect on the mind was like dragging a rake across a disordered patch of sand or gravel. The desert seemed to soothe and calm the tempestuous mind that always bounced off the inside of my cranium. It was not inspiration, it was exhalation and nothingness. I soloed my first 3 landings at Mojave Airport. My instructor said I'd been ready 10 days before, but the landing traffic at Santa Monica was always ridiculous, sometimes up to 20 aircraft in the circuit at once, so we delayed until our first cross-country flight, which was to Mojave. I remember him being very quiet for the whole trip. We landed, and the engine was still running as he opened the door on the Cessna 172. "I'll be in the control tower watching," he said. 3 landings and then shut down in front of the tower. I was on my own at last. To be honest, it was quite anticlimactic. It would have been far more emotional had I soloed after 6 or 7 hours back in Kissimmee, where they cut the tail off the shirt you were wearing and pinned it to the wall when you went solo. Conditions were ideal. No wind, enormous runway, so I shut down in front of the tower and completed my checklists. Solo meant I could, after a couple more trips to different airfields with my instructor, fly solo cross-country flights on my own. In fact, it was a requirement, including 1 solo flight of 240 nautical miles in one day with landings at 3 different airports. I was approaching my flight exam. The examiner was booked, and I felt confident. My written exam was passed. I just had to complete 7 more hours of cross-country solo flying. Saturday afternoon, the skies clear of cloud, was a glorious trip to Palm Springs and back, roasting hot on the ground, but a little chilly at 9,500 feet on the way out. 1 more trip would do it. So I planned to fly to Las Vegas and back on the Sunday, with an early start, leaving plenty of time to get back before sunset. The first time you are really scared in an aeroplane is a memorable event, and I've never forgotten that Sunday. I've had other situations since then when I could have been as scared, or maybe should have been, but this one experience acted like a kind of vaccine for the soul. Be afraid and be scared, but panic will kill you, not fear. The clear blue sky, the calm wind, and runway 03 at Santa Monica Airport beckoned. I was the very first person to start his engine that Sunday morning. The weather in Las Vegas was benign, and I decided to fly along the mountains that topped 8,000 feet before turning north through the Cajon Pass up into the high desert some 3,000 feet above sea level. The takeoff was smooth, the sky deserted, and I quickly picked up a radar code with a helpful controller who had advised me of any other traffic. Uncle Sam was watching over me. I climbed to 7,500 feet, and it started to get cold as I paralleled the snow-capped peaks, heading out over Ontario Airport and towards San Bernardino. Shortly before turning north into the jagged gash that was the Cajon Pass, I felt the tail of the aircraft rock from side to side, and then a couple of bumps under the belly, which knocked the nose upward. I levelled the wings using the control column and steadied the tail by exerting more pressure with my feet on the rudder pedals. "Any reports of turbulence?" I asked Uncle Sam. "Nope." He sounded bored. Not much going on at 8:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The bumps continued. This was becoming tedious. I took a quick look at the chart. I would descend 2,000 feet to 5,500 and escape the lumps and bumps that were disturbing my otherwise perfect day. I thought I would tell the controller not that he was controlling me, and I did detect a hint of uncertainty in my voice as I announced, I'm just descending 5,500 feet to clear the turbulence. Okay. Now he really sounded bored. I started a gradual descent, and the rocking and rolling stopped. As I approached my chosen altitude, I opened the throttle and started a gentle left turn in the Cahoon Pass. Below me lay the speckled grey hills and interstate arteries of California, rail and road, climbing the steep incline from sea level to the plateau 3,000 feet above. At that precise moment, a sleeping giant awoke. Invisible but tangible, it seized the back of my aircraft and twisted it like a wet towel, smashing my head from side to side in the cockpit. Next, a giant invisible fist smashed the top of the wing and pressed down, forcing me into my seat, and I realized that the altimeter was unwinding rapidly and I was going down. I raised the nose and applied full power. I looked at the vertical speed indicator. It was pegged at over 1,000 feet per minute down, as the vicious brute smashed at the tail, upward, downward, and sideways. The wings rocked as I fought with the control column to keep them level. The nose was high, and I heard the bleep of the stall warning system telling me that any further nose up and I would lose what little lift I had left to fight the monster, crushing the small piece of tin that was my life support system. A momentary calculation as I looked ahead at the rising terrain. It was at 3,000 feet. I'd started at 5,500 feet and was going down at 1,000 feet per minute or greater, with full power. My hands were slick, and I could feel sweat dripping from my armpits and dribbling down my chest. I could see the headline, "The Fool Who Thought He Could Fly." At this rate, I had maybe 2 minutes to impact. I forced myself to grip my terror. I squeezed it really, really hard. I had my fear by the throat in one hand, and with the other, I thought to crash the aircraft somewhere survivable. So I'd better start looking below. The whole area was swathed in power lines. Great. Electrocution or decapitation, both best avoided. And then the evil giant relinquished his grasp, to be replaced by mischievous angels. My ears popped and I swallowed to clear them as my tiny machine was borne heavenward on invisible wings. The altimeter was rising again and the vertical speed indicator was pegged at over 1,000 feet per minute, upward. I pulled the throttle back to idle, to no effect. I was being tossed upward like a feather and I was drifting over to the other side of the V-shaped pass. The entire cycle had lost me 500 feet, and as I approached the top of the ridgeline again, the whole roller coaster started again. Down I went, full throttle. Up I went, throttle at the idle. All the time losing around 500 feet as the ground came up to greet me with each iteration. Finally, I staggered through the pass and out into the high desert with about 1,500 feet to spare. I still had another 2.5 hours of flying before I got to North Las Vegas Airport. Somehow, I made it. I landed in Vegas and bought an omelette and chips. I was so shaken up, I thought I might just give up. I was sick to the pit of my stomach, though luckily I'm not one to decorate the toilet with good food. Chapter 30. Out of the Frying Pan. Tears of a Dragon was the big track on Balls to Picasso, and most of it was done at Goodnight LA Studios. Of the various other tracks, most of them sounded emasculated, and that was just a product of the people involved. I didn't feel any closer to a new beginning, except when I worked with Roy Z, who enabled me to be myself as opposed to overthinking who or what I should be. Gradually, the pendulum was swinging back to more conventional rock and roll, but I loved the rhythmic nuances that Roy and the Tribe offered, the sheer groove that was available. One thing was clear to me. The word cathartic was starting to apply to the entire process, and flying was amplifying my reality. I'd written a song called Original Sin, which was about the relationship between me and my father. It never made the album, but it's one of the darker songs from the Keith Olsen sessions. I felt quite guilty about the chorus. Maybe it was just me feeling sorry for myself. Maybe it was too cruel. Tell me, Father, where have you been all these years in original sin? I saw you each day, we had nothing to say, and now it's too late to begin. Whatever the result of the song, good, bad, or indifferent, it was those words that made me wonder what I was doing in Iron Maiden, given the way the albums were going. I spent my days in a strange mixture of euphoria and uncertainty. One morning, the LA Times lay strewn around the floor, most of it disposable advertising supplements, and I managed to locate the bits pertaining to actual news and opinion. Thought for the Day was a feature I seldom noticed, but on this day, I read it. It was a quote from the writer Henry Miller. "All growth is a leap in the dark, a spontaneous, unpremeditated act without the benefit of experience." So at that moment, I decided to leave Iron Maiden. You can blame Henry Miller. You'd imagine that for such a potentially life-changing decision, I would have made a plan. But whether from naivety or just plain enthusiasm, I hadn't. Rod Smallwood came round to the studio in LA and I played him some of my material. "I've got some good news and some bad news," I said. Rod shifted in his chair and started to look a trifle uncomfortable. "What's the bad news?" "Well, the bad news is that I feel I have to leave the band, so I thought I'd tell you first." "What's the good news?" "Well," I began brightly, "now you have a whole new solo artist to manage. You'll find another singer for Iron Maiden. It won't be so difficult. There are plenty of them about." He didn't look convinced. "Shall I tell Steve?" I asked. No, don't talk to anyone. I'll deal with it all." And of course, he did deal with it, in exactly the way you would expect of one of the best managers in the world. I still don't know what he told the rest of the band, but I'm sure his mind was already spinning damage limitation and making plans to avoid a rock and roll Chernobyl in the media. The 2 live albums released in the wake of my resignation were not the finest in our repertoire, and the second, a real dead one, seemed almost prophetic in retrospect. Nevertheless, my departure was stage-managed so as not to disturb the delicate equilibrium between perception and reality. I would do one last tour, followed by a one-off TV special featuring an illusionist called Simon Drake. I happily agreed to be sacrificed in an Iron Maiden at the climax of the proceedings, blood gushing out of my mouth as the spikes penetrated my body. Just to make the point, the cover of the single Hallowed Be Thy Name featured yours truly being skewered through the chest whilst being roasted over the fires of hell like a long-haired marshmallow. Not exactly a flying start to a solo career, but then again, people who left Iron Maiden had traditionally fallen quietly into obscurity or been reduced to karaoke-style nostalgia. What happened now was entirely up to me. Balls to Picasso had limited success. In retrospect, it should have been a much harder and heavier album. Much of this could have been achieved if Roy Z had produced it, but out of caution, Shea Baby was given the honours. It was a little too early to throw Mr. Z into the pot head first. I think Maiden fans were variously angry, confused, and many other emotions as well over my departure. As the old military adage goes, no battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. The nearest war going on was in Bosnia. I was about to have that first contact. Chapter 31. Into the Fire. The phone rang at home. "How would you like to do a gig in Sarajevo?" "Isn't there a proper shooting war going on?" "Oh, yes, but it's all sorted by the UN. You'll be fully protected. It's all planned out." We weren't protected. There was no plan, and the bullets were real. But fuck it, we went anyway. Metallica and Motorhead supposedly turned it down. I'm not surprised. If I'd been their manager, I would have done too. I didn't exactly tell my manager. In no way did what happened resemble what was supposed to happen. What did occur became one of those events that changed the way I viewed life, death, other human beings, and traffic lights. I got a band together and we loaded up 500 pounds of equipment onto a 737 and embarked on a military charter flight to Split in Croatia. The aircraft was half full of soldiers who looked at us with faint disdain. They were getting paid for putting themselves in harm's way. We were getting paid zero. It was winter in the Balkan Mountains. I bought a rucksack. I wore my army boots on stage anyway, plus the old Swiss army greatcoat I'd worn for the video of Tears of a Dragon. Underneath, I had my old smock from my TA days, lots of pockets, nice and warm, plus a woolly hat. I shoved a bottle of Jameson whiskey in for good measure. I thought the bottle might go down well with our organiser. His name was Major Martin, and he had his own rock show on Radio Zid, which was a local station still broadcasting in Sarajevo itself. The plan was to arrive in Split, don flak jackets and blue UN helmets, jump in a Sea King helicopter, fly to Sarajevo, do the gig and come home. Job done. We got as far as Split. I saw the helmets and jackets piled up in a corner of the arrivals hall. A Colonel Green met us, and no, this was not a game of Cluedo. "Are you chaps the British rock band?" he said. It was one of the more obvious questions I've ever been asked. I nodded. "Well, sorry, but you have to go home. Here are your boarding passes." He brandished our return travel documents. We would be going home on the same aircraft that had bought us. "What if we don't go?" I asked. "Next flight is in 1 week," replied the Colonel. "In any case, there are no spare helicopters and the weather is bad. Also, the UN have got wind of it and Akashi doesn't want to upset the Serbs." Akashi was the UN envoy with a reputation for appeasement. Colonel Green walked away, obviously busy with more important things than a bunch of crazy longhairs wanting martyrdom. Outside were row upon row of white-painted UN trucks and armoured cars. This was a major military base, as well as a civilian airport. I was sure we would start getting in someone's way very shortly. A cameraman from a Reuters news team walked over. They'd been hanging around in a corner of the tiny arrivals area. "I am Bosnian. This is bullshit. We can get you into the city," he said. At the risk of invalidating the little or no life insurance that any of us had, I engaged in further inquiry. "Go on." "That is a tunnel, a secret entrance. We can get you in. It's how we resupply the city." "OK," I said, slowly turning the wheels in my mind. "How do we do that?" "I am friend of President Izetbegovic. I call him and get permission," he declared proudly. He started putting loose change together and squeezed his body into a tiny phone booth, chatting away intensely for a couple of minutes. Finally, he put the receiver down. "Well, what did he say?" I asked. "He's not in right now, he's busy." I looked at our small pile of gear, at the ragtag band of faces, and a terrified Roland Hyams, a publicist who had thought that this was going to be like Glastonbury without the chilled Chablis and yurts. "We can get into Sarajevo, maybe," I said. "There's a tunnel. If we go back, we'll never get there. If we stay, we might get there. Worst case, we stay and drink cheap beer for a week and find somewhere local to do a gig." Actually, worst case was being blown to smithereens by a Serb anti-aircraft shell or landmine or getting hit by a sniper's bullet. I put it to the vote with a promise that if one person dropped out, none of us would go, and no one would think less of him as a result. I meant it. Everyone was up for it, including the guys who were just a tiny bit terrified. They admitted to the fear and voted to go anyway. I took the boarding passes and returned them to Colonel Green. "Sorry, we're staying. We'll take our chances on getting through the tunnel." He took back the passes and thought for a moment. "Stay right here," he ordered, and scurried away, looking busier than usual. 20 minutes elapsed before he returned. "Right," he started. There was a note in his voice that said he was in charge of something, rather than tiptoeing around it. "You are no longer anything to do with the UN. You are therefore guests of the British Army. As such, you will store your kit in the armoury for now, and I suggest we take you to the officers' mess for a pot of tea." The drum kit and guitar amps stacked up against mortars, small arms and magazines would have made a great picture, but we forgot to take one. By midnight, we'd been up all day and had tea and lectures about the war. An RAF intelligence officer stood in front of the big map board and explained exactly what was going on. The situation was not pretty. I still have the set of tactical maps they gave me as a souvenir. We were into our first can of beer when the door was flung open. "In the truck, lads, you're going." It was T-shirt weather during the day in Split, but chilly by night, and it was below freezing where we were going. Come to think of it, where were we going? In what? And driven by whom? The Serious Road Trip was an NGO, a non-governmental organisation, that operated relief convoys in areas the UN deemed too dangerous to contemplate. It famously drove a red London bus into no man's land during the Balkans conflict and ran a clown school for the children of both sides. The Serious Road Trip was going to take us into the war zone, and we would drive overnight via Mostar and into the mountains, finally ascending the mighty Mount Igman. At the summit, the army would take over. Armoured personnel carriers would meet us at Bosnian Army checkpoint Bravo 1, and from there take us into Sarajevo itself. So much for the plan. Our vehicle was an open-backed truck, a 4x4 with a canvas-hooped top. We loaded the gear into the back and noted the pile of sleeping bags on the planked and metal-framed floor. This would be us for the next 10 hours in near-pitch blackness. 2 crates of beer were chucked in for good measure by the chirpy young South African volunteer. He was going with us as he'd done the run before. The driver was a young architecture student from Edinburgh. We had no escort, protection, helmets or flak jackets, but we had a secret weapon. Who would possibly want to shoot at a vehicle painted like ours? The truck was bright yellow, with rather capable renderings of Asterix the Gaul, Felix the cat, and Roadrunner painted prominently on the sides and rear tailgate. It was the camouflage of imbeciles. And who would want to shoot an imbecile? We scrambled in the back and made ourselves comfy. Comfort, of course, is relative, and is as much a state of mind as an objective reality. I wedged my backside up against a flight case in the truck, figuring that between the axles was probably less spine-shattering than directly over them. I remembered the bottle of Jameson in my rucksack. I pulled it out. I'd been saving it for Major Martin. Not any fucking more, I thought, and I cracked it open, just as Roland Hyams started rolling his first joint with a small piece of cannabis resin. "Where the hell did you get that?" "I've had it in the corner of my mouth since England." I had several uncharitable thoughts, but just let out a very heavy sigh instead. He could easily end up dead, so having got this far, he might as well puff away, because it would all be gone by morning. My days of spliffs were long gone, so I passed the whiskey round. The night passed slowly, sleep was fitful, and the cold seeped deeply into our limbs. The world was disappearing behind us through the canvas flap, suffused with a faint red glow from our taillights, which painted shadows in the thick fog that had now enveloped us. We slowed to a crawl, then stopped. I poked my head out of the back. Petrol station. Did people actually stop for petrol in a war? I suppose they did. I decided to sit up front in the cab. We would soon be approaching the base of Mount Igman, the 7,000-foot beast that marked the front line into Sarajevo. Now we drove into utter blackness. Before, there'd been occasional dim streaks of white light by the roadside. In the distance, I could make out the gigantic rock that was Igman. It was easier to see because there was a war going on at the top of it. Star shells and parachute flares hung in the sky, a firework display presaging death and destruction for those unfortunate souls atop the mountain, which was, of course, where we were headed. As I pondered this, we stopped fairly abruptly, as one does when a man steps out into the road and points an AK-47 at you. There are more friendly ways to hitch a lift, but I suppose in a war zone, thumbs have been superseded by bullets and gun barrels. Our hitcher turned out to be a Bosnian soldier who was fed up with walking and needed a lift to the base of the mountain. He chattered away in Bosnian, and we were almost conversing in sign language when we bade him goodbye. He melted into the darkness, and at around 5:30 a.m, we started the long crawl up the precipitous track to the summit. "Have you done this before?" I asked our driver. "No, first time." I didn't want to distract him. The gravel and dirt track twisted viciously, and the headlights peered into the darkness beyond the edge. It was almost a sheer drop in places. Some of the lads do this without lights, he offered matter-of-factly. I said nothing. He switched off the headlights. Tell you what, I said, how about we switch them back on again? And what a tale those headlights told. In the pre-dawn gloom, we drove through the remnants of the Bosnian army going home. The headlights tracked along the rows of pine trees, and I remember thinking how beautiful this place would have been, and maybe would be again if ever there was peace. Every few hundred yards was a war drama. 2 white ambulances with red crosses, windows wound down, bullet holes in the doors, blood streaming down the sides. A dump truck full of combatants carrying plastic bags and wearing half their uniforms, wearily returning to what was left of their city. We were on top of the mountain. The firefight was over, and like everything else in this crazy war, who knew what had happened and who had won? Answer to both questions: nobody. Finally, we stopped in the snow-covered forest. The track curved away to the left, down a steep incline towards Sarajevo and the front line. Ahead lay a small caravan on wooden piles, smoke coming from a wood-burning stove. A single strand of telephone wire hung across the road and connected the shed to somewhere. We had arrived at Bosnian Army Checkpoint, Bravo 1. In front of the caravan was a washing line. The woolens and sheets were frozen stiff. I got down from the truck. I couldn't see any armoured personnel carriers. They were, of course, supposed to be there. I knocked on the caravan door. 2 soldiers, 1 male, 1 female, were warming themselves by the stove. I passed them a PR photo of the band and tried to explain our predicament. A shot of whiskey helped. We were all smiles later, but I was none the wiser as to our next plan. Down below in the valley, Sarajevo was totally obscured by thick white cloud. Like an inland sea, it rolled between the valley sides. The entire vista was Serb-controlled, except for the spot on which I stood. Anti-aircraft guns modified to shoot horizontally ringed the basin, so they could shoot into the city or, for that matter, at the summit where I was standing. There was no serious attempt to dry the washing hanging on the line. It was a sniper screen. Sarajevo was full of shitty clothes flapping in the breeze to obscure day-to-day activities, lest a Serb sniper should take a dislike to your children. The sound of a revving engine broke the silence. Around the corner bounced and clattered a battered VW Golf. It pulled up, and the occupants got out, high-fived each other, and then drove off. Shortly afterwards, the bread van arrived in similar fashion, delivering 1 loaf for the people in the caravan. The driver spoke a little German, and with a bit of the sign language that had served us well, he proudly displayed the bullet hole in his front windscreen, exactly where his head should have been. "He tried to fuck me! Nicht tod!" exhorted the baker. The butcher and the candlestick maker were nowhere to be seen, but the warming rays of the sun did illuminate our local sniper, flitting in and out of the trees with a bedroll attached to his back and what looked like a hunting rifle with a telescopic sight. It was the only weapon I'd seen since the AK-47 at the base of the mountain. It turned out there weren't enough guns to go round, so people waited till somebody died or was wounded, and then their weapon was passed on. Actually, not strictly true. Our team in the caravan had 1 axe, used for chopping wood, and the man had a highly polished hand grenade in his belt. The sun came up at 8:30. The fog had turned to mist, and Sarajevo started to become visible, like a long rasher of bacon in the valley below. We'd been there for 2 hours. We were also going to be in plain view of whoever was pointing guns at the track that descended into the city. That was the good news. The bad news was that our armoured vehicles had been stopped at the base of the hill. The local Bosnian commander had found an NBC camera team in one and threw his toys out of the cot. We would have to drive down the hill ourselves in full sight of the Serb guns. Surely no one would kill an imbecile. This imbecile begged to differ. We started round the corner and down the single-track path. As I looked down to my right, I could see the twisted remains of the other vehicles that had been blown off the road. A prickly feeling began at the back of my neck. In a most bizarre circumstance, we stopped. Coming the other way, up the track, was a Coca-Cola delivery lorry. There's a Gary Larson cartoon of two deer conversing in a forest. One has a target on his chest. The caption reads, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal." As I stood in the open whilst our truck backed up into a passing space, I felt exactly like the cartoon critter. The Coca-Cola lorry passed and we made our way to the bottom of the hill where white-painted armoured personnel vehicles waited to finally greet us. I met the very enthusiastic Major Martin and we bade goodbye to our yellow cartoon 4x4. The gig was the same night, so sleep, food, a press conference and a sound check were the order of the day. But first, the drive into the shattered city. The airport perimeter road was the front line. Both sides lay entrenched yards from each other as the UN vehicles passed between them in the grey mist. I was given a blue UN helmet and told to keep my head down. After a few minutes, I poked my head out just enough to see the devastation. As we passed rows of semi-demolished houses, children scuttled between them like rats. The war had reduced families to a feral existence, and the city, including the military, was down to 3 days' supply of food and fuel, and even that was at a minimum level of consumption. The city that hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics had been smashed beyond recognition. Fronts of buildings were a facade as the back was blown away, or simply the entire structure was pockmarked with cavities and pebble-dashed with bullets and cannon shells. In streets strewn with rubble, cars stood like colanders, hundreds of bullet holes ventilating them. I could not for the life of me think what it was about a humble Renault that had provoked what must have been about 200 bullet holes. It was so extraordinary that I took a picture of it. A river divides the higher and lower sides of Sarajevo as it progresses down the valley. The Serbs controlled the high ground and the snipers fired into civilians on their way to work. Sniper Alley was the name given to the highway that ran from the airport in a straight line to the city. Every time you drove up and down this road, you rolled the dice. We rolled it several times. The locals rolled it twice a day or more. We arrived at the UN headquarters, the former Olympic Village. The road crew got billeted in the bit with concrete sandbags instead of windows. The band got the penthouse suite, of course, which had iron bunk beds with old mattresses and the ubiquitous sniper tape covering the windows. Breakfast was a cheese roll and a beer, plus I donated what was left of the whiskey to Major Martin. He popped it in his desk drawer before proudly pointing to a dinner plate-sized cavity on the wall behind his desk, just above his head. "50 caliber shell," he grinned. "Ha! Bastards haven't got me yet." Don't waste time before drinking that whiskey, I thought. The spirit of the Blitz was alive and well and living in Sarajevo. The night was already falling when we woke up, with the cold starting to gnaw at our bones. We headed for the press conference. The Brits had managed to put together something resembling canapes, Ritz crackers with ketchup, and I sat with the local bands who would support us. There was no electricity, and the generators to power the gig would only be switched on moments before in order to save fuel. The guitarist next to me spoke some English. "How do you rehearse with no power?" I asked. He cut me a glance as if to say, "What sort of a ridiculous question is that?" "We rehearse," he began proudly, "with our spirit." Put firmly in my place, I nodded. "I believe you do," I muttered. The Bosnian Cultural Centre has probably been remodelled as you read this, but when I visited in 2015, it was identical to the place we played in 1994. The corner of the building back then had been rather impressively melted by an anti-aircraft rocket, but most of it was below ground. Word had got out about the concert, and because the Serbs were in the habit of mortaring public gatherings, schools had been closed and kids made their way home furtively, lest they become a target. Queuing round the block in Sarajevo was not just tiresome, it was life-threatening. There were rumours that wealthy nationalists paid money to go on assassination vacations in the war zone. The head of the UN Fire Service claimed that he had a Serb hitman gunning for him back home in Connecticut. Like most things in this zone of lunacy, it was best taken with a pinch of salt. Our jolly fireman was the local CIA rep. The perversion of normal behaviour and the corruption of innocence was brought home to me when we visited an orphanage, which, sadly, was a work in progress, as fathers were being killed on an ongoing basis. At first, we saw the infants, tightly swaddled like small mummies in an impossibly hot room. One male nurse in a lab coat was metaphorically spinning plates, trying to keep them quiet. Their expressions were like masks, devoid of emotion, bereft of human touch. I made the fatal error of picking one up and feeling the warm pulse of humanity in my arms. First, its dark eyes fixed on my face. Then the hands started to open, a gurgle, a smile, and a finger seized with the force that only a newborn can muster. The tears that flowed were of confusion, joy, anger, and sorrow. What kind of a world was this innocent going to inherit? Chaos ensued rapidly. One gurgling infant led to the others awakening from their suspended animation, like a room of clocks, all striking midnight at different times. Panic-stricken, our plate-spinning lab-coated jailer rushed from cot to cot, desperately trying to put his charges back into the dead zone. Now the whole ward was anarchy, babies standing up, laughing, giggling, quite literally throwing things out of their cot. I'd never thought of myself as a baby anarchist before, but I had a massive grin on the side of my face as we left the room. As Doc McCoy said in Star Trek, "It's life, Jim." The bigger kids played outside in the exposed cellars and broken staircases. The lack of adults meant that the big boys looked after the tribe in what looked uncomfortably like it might have been a scene from Lord of the Flies by William Golding. We had a pair of drumsticks, an acoustic guitar, and yours truly. So we started busking with Alex Elena, our Italian drummer, tapping away at the soot-blackened wall. It was a slightly awkward moment as we realised that many of these children had never seen a guitar, let alone touched one. They were spellbound. "Hey!" Alex shouted. "Everyone clap, come on!" And he started enthusiastically putting his hands together. In a moment still burned in my brain, one of the older children leapt up and clapped his hands, rat-a-tat, at the nearest group of kids. They fell down dead. The clapping was the sound of death, of machine guns and snipers. And so the next group fell down too, until all the small children lay with their limbs flailed out, frozen at the point of death. We stopped playing, dumbstruck. The kids got up and fell about laughing. It brought home to me how such a small thing as clapping can be twisted and subverted by the grim realities of a war zone. Down at the show, I was amazed to see a modern PA system had been set up. Our sound engineer, Jed from Ireland, was scratching his head in wonderment. Where the fuck they got this from, I don't know, but it's good kit. It all works. I soon found out. The hall was rammed, and the heat from the bodies was cooking the air. This wasn't a war zone. This was freedom. This was rock and roll. Time to remember joy. The sound check was fine, and with 10 minutes till stage time, I was summoned by Major Martin. "We have a problem," he said. I met the problem upstairs. It was the group of bandits who had purloined, hijacked the PA. They wanted money, or they would take it away. There were 6 of them, all Bosnians, an interpreter, and Major Martin, whose hand was starting to twitch around the butt of his sidearm. "I have paid you $500, the Major said, cue bandits mumbling. "They want another 500, said the interpreter. "They say they are professionals." "I will pay them out of the T-shirt money," Major Martin offered in exasperation. Another round of bandit mumbling. No deal. "Let's have another coffee," I suggested, and smiled at them. "Why don't they want to help their own people? I'm not getting paid for this," the interpreter relayed. More mumbling, and a little bit of discussion ensued. The coffees arrived, thick shots like black mud. They say they are professionals. OK, tell them I'm a professional too, and I promise they will be paid. Well, this went down well. The ringleader gave me a bear hug, and I thought we had resolved the issue. Not quite. In stepped a blue pullover, with a man called Trevor wearing it. Trevor was, I later found out, assigned to be our personal security. He was not best pleased when Major Martin took us on an unguarded tour around the war zone in a Land Rover, and he was definitely not best pleased now. Trevor claimed to be an off-duty fireman from Glasgow. If you want to see Trevor in reality, there is an appalling, iconic picture of the shooting of a young mother and her 5-year-old child captured by a news photographer. The child lies in the street in a pool of blood, and Trevor is one of 2 soldiers leaping out of a UN vehicle to try to save the boy's life and protect the other innocents at the scene. Trevor had heart and soul, 2 Heckler & Koch submachine guns and a sidearm, and he was standing right beside me, pointing angrily at the bandit ringleader. "You," he spat, "I will personally deal with if any harm comes to any of these bands." Trevor was probably a rotten fireman, but I suspect he was a very good shot. The bandits erupted in a flurry of "poor me" gestures and loud groaning. The interpreter was about to translate. "Do not translate what he said," I said. Tell them, Trevor is concerned that the building will be damaged if we don't go on stage soon, and someone might get hurt." Care and maintenance of soft furnishings in a war zone was an ironic bluff, but it bought time. "What the fuck is going on?" I hissed. "These fuckers here threaten to break the legs of the support bands if they don't pay protection money for using the PA," Trevor said. "Trev, once we've done this gig, I don't care what happens to these bozos.